Chapter 22 Bridge Building Heroes. Many fast-growing American cities started on the banks of wide rivers. To expand, they had to find ways to carry thousands of daily passengers out beyond the old city limits and even beyond the neighboring waterway. Go-getting American engineers transformed the ancient art of bridge building to help the cities to reach out to their new frontiers. Something about bridge building especially attracted the American inventive genius. James Buchanan Eads, the man who built the bridge for St. Louis, first showed his inventive talents during the Civil War. He served as an advisor to the Union Navy. In 1861, he proposed a fleet of ironclad gunboats to control the Mississippi River. When the government took up his suggestion, he made the ships in 65 days. St. Louis was on the west bank of the Mississippi. After the war, the city leaders saw that if St. Louis was to grow, they had to bring the railroad across the wide river and into their city. Thoughtful people offered many different schemes, but the leaders rejected every one until Eads appeared. As a boy, Eads had worked on a river steamboat. When only 22 years old, he had invented a diving bell to salvage ships that had sunk in the river. And then he had done a lot of walking underwater on the very bottom of the Mississippi. He knew that river bottom almost as well as other men knew the city streets. What Eads had learned was important. Building a bridge across the Mississippi depended first on finding solid support under the sandy river bottom. As Eads had moved along 65 feet below the surface of the water, he saw the swift currents churning up the sands. He knew that the supports for his bridge would have to go far below those river sands, all the way down to bedrock. In 1867, when Eads began construction, his first problem was to lay the foundation of the two stone towers that would hold up the arches of the bridge in midstream. The towers would rise 50 feet above water level. The foundation of one would have to go down 86 feet below water level, and the other, where bedrock was deeper, had to go down 123 feet. But was this possible? Eads' plan was to use his own diving bell together with some new caissons, watertight working chambers, that had recently been perfected in England. The 75-foot wide caissons would keep out the water while the men dug, and the men would keep digging beneath the river sands until they reached solid rock. When his men finally reached bedrock, they were working 10 stories below the surface of the water. Because of the great pressures at that depth, the men could stay down only 45 minutes at a time. They had to come up slowly. Between shifts, they rested for long periods. Despite all precautions, 13 men died from too rapid changes in air pressure. They called it caisson disease, or the bends.
What is it again?
The Mississippi River boatmen and ferrymen feared competition from the new railroad that would cross the bridge. They tried to persuade the Secretary of War to take the towers apart, even when they were only half built. President Grant knew St. Louis, and he had faith in Eads. He knew the bridge would be important to the future of the city and to the growth of the Middle West, and he saw that it would help bind the nation together. He ordered the engineers in the War Department to keep the project going. For the three vast arches of the bridge, Eads decided to use steel, though no one had ever used it in such a large structure. When the usual carbon steel did not meet his tests, he ordered large quantities of the new chromium steel. Then he supervised its production. While chromium steel was more costly, it was rust-proof and needed no covering. It took Eads 7 years to finish bridging the Mississippi. Finally, in a grand ceremony in 1874, the former Union General, William T. Sherman, pounded the last spike of the double-tracked railroad that crossed the bridge. The 14 locomotives, 2 by 2, chugged triumphantly across the river. President Grant came to St. Louis to proclaim Eads an American hero. Other heroic bridge builders helped open ways to the suburban frontiers. Few other cities are quite so hemmed in by water as New York. The East River, the Hudson River, and the Atlantic Ocean surround Manhattan Island, the heart of the city. For a half-century, people had made proposals for a bridge across the East River. They wanted a bridge to connect lower Manhattan Island to Brooklyn. Then the fierce winter of 1866 to 67 stopped all ferry service and isolated Brooklyn from Manhattan for days. It was plain that something had to be done. John Roebling was ready with a plan. He came to the United States from Germany as a young man and opened the first factory that made wire rope from many strands of wire twisted together. This new material was wonderfully suited for reaching over wide rivers where it was difficult or impossible to build masonry towers in midstream. You could suspend the bridge from strong wire rope held up by high towers on both ends. If, for example, you wanted to span the Niagara River near the falls, you would have to do it by such a suspension bridge. Roebling completed a wire support bridge over the Niagara in 1855. It was strong enough to carry fully loaded trains. This feat made John Roebling famous. In 1860, Roebling completed another suspension bridge just outside Pittsburgh. It reached 1,000 feet across the Allegheny River. And by 1867, he had completed still another outside Cincinnati across the Ohio River. A suspension bridge Roebling style could solve New York's problem. For the bridge from Manhattan to Brooklyn had to stay high above water level in order to allow the sails and smokestacks of large ocean-going vessels to pass underneath. Roebling's ambitious plan in 1867 proposed towers 271 feet above water level. They would hold a main suspension span of 1,595 feet. During the very beginning of construction in 1869, a ferry crushed John Roebling's foot against the dock, and he died from tetanus infection in 2 weeks. John Roebling's son, Washington Roebling, was ready to carry on. He, too, was a man of courage. He had enlisted in the Union Army as a private on the day after President Lincoln first appealed for volunteers. By the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, young Washington Roebling's services had earned him the rank of colonel. On the second day of the battle, he helped drag a cannon up a strategic hilltop with his own hands. His actions had helped to prevent the defeat of the Union Army. On his father's death, Washington Roebling at once took over building the bridge. In 1872, fire in the Brooklyn caisson threatened the whole project. Roebling stayed below in the compressed air chamber for 7 hours. As a result, he acquired caisson disease, and he never fully recovered. Too weak to supervise the bridge on the spot, he sat in a wheelchair in his apartment and watched the work through field glasses. Then he gave instructions to his wife, and she carried them down to the bridge. All his communications with the world went through her. People tried to remove him from the job, but his mind remained active, and he would not give up the command. Meanwhile, he taught his wife, Emily, everything he knew so they could work together to keep the construction of the bridge going. She had learned all about math, geometry, and physics that was needed to build cables and calculate curves that were needed to build the bridge. She became so good at these things that when the bridge was finally completed, over 14 years later, many wondered whether she, and not Washington, had essentially worked as chief engineer.
No, she did.
Whoever it was that did the engineering during these long years, it was Emily who worked closely with politicians and competed against other engineers to make sure the builders created the bridge her husband had envisioned. 14 years after John Roebling began the job, at 1:30 on the afternoon of May 24, 1883, President Chester A. Arthur and his cabinet joined with Governor Grover Cleveland of New York to formally open the Brooklyn Bridge. 6 warships anchored below the bridge fired a resounding salute, and for the center of the bridge they launched a dazzling display of fireworks. The orator of the occasion declared that this was the world's greatest bridge and was a triumph of the faith of the saint and courage of the hero. The saint, Mrs. Roebling herself, attended the celebrations, but Washington Roebling was too ill to leave the room from which he had overseen the work. The President of the United States went to Roebling's simple apartment at number 110 Columbia Heights to give his congratulations.